What's happening, guys and girls? Acrinator here, and welcome to another video. Today we'll be finishing up the last of the main formal reviews I've had in my backlog, where we'll be covering one of the titles in my library with the greatest potential. And that's saying something considering some of the games we've covered in recent months. Anyways, without further ado, let's dive straight into this review of Ori and the Blind Forest. For those of you that have somehow never heard of this game, Ori and the Blind Forest is a Metroidvania action role-playing game developed by Moon Studios and published by Microsoft Studios. It originally released back in 2015, with a definitive edition coming out in 2016. Ori was met with critical acclaim for its unique art style, heart-wrenching story, and beautifully challenging gameplay. The majority of the criticisms levied against the title came out as a result of the inherent difficulty as well as the base game's lack of depth for certain characters, the latter of which was remedied some in the definitive edition, though I'll touch more on that in just a few minutes. What made this project such a shock to just about every major critic in the video game industry is that it lived up to the original hype generated from its first press release in 2014's E3. Some might go as far as saying Ori even surpassed it, though I'll leave the interpretation of the past up to those with more time to give to such endeavors. Suffice to say that Ori and the Blind Forest made quite the impression on enough of an audience to nurture a buzz. I personally first caught wind of the title shortly after its release, when I began seeing dozens of positive reviews come out. The game looked like it was enjoyable enough, though I was a bit put off by the supposed difficulty. Sure enough, however, a large Steam sale came around and my curiosity got the better of me. If you've watched any part of my live-streamed playthroughs of this title, you likely already know in what direction this review will head. Like the majority of games that come out in today's day and age, it's usually what we see that acts as an introduction to a title before we ever get to try it for ourselves. On the surface, Ori is an incredibly picturesque game with a 2.5D side-scrolling style that looks almost as though it would fit into a storybook setting. Just about everything you come in contact with looks as though it's been handcrafted on a watercolor canvas, and likewise, the general movement feels very fluid. Granted, the action may come off as jarring at first, though I found that I became accustomed rather quickly, thankfully allowing for me to progress without feeling visually overwhelmed. One aspect that helps in distinguishing your surroundings the further you continue down the game's linear story would be in the art style laid out for each individual area. The color palette shifts slightly depending on which section of the map you're traversing through. A rather subtle effect, I know, but one that can help you get your bearings as well as set the mood for the game's progression. As I stated previously, the action can seem rather intense at times when playing through the earlier levels, though you should find yourself slowly getting into a groove with your combat rotations. One major plus side is that Ori allows for a large variety of playstyles, including a more passive approach like myself, or running in like a man possessed. Depending on how brave you are, the game lets you get away with just about anything you're mechanically gifted enough to pull off. The combat, while fast-paced, isn't quite as bad as many reviewers out there would lead you to believe. When I first heard about this game, I thought it would be more akin to something like Dark Souls with how much its supposed difficulty was brought up. Let me make myself entirely clear, Ori and the Blind Forest is not difficult. It does take a bit of competence in regards to platforming, timing, and general hand-eye coordination, but I don't consider myself that good. You can just watch any part of my playthrough, or even the footage you're watching now, since they're both one and the same, to see how little I got hung up on any given part. The most challenging aspects, besides the occasional race against time, would have to be the segments where important enemies or objects blended too well with the background, and even those weren't impossible to figure out after a few quick failures. There is something to be said for the little direction you were given, other than a partially complete map and a general route to get to your next destination, though that's nothing even remotely in the realm of game breaking. This is something I've seen misrepresenting Ori all too often, and I've personally seen some of my friends turn away from this title as a result. Will you be tested through moderately challenging levels? Yes. Will you be forced to rage quit because Moon Studios didn't quite understand the delicate art of balance? Absolutely not. I'll likely end up making a longer video on this topic in particular one day, but for now, know that it's very likely that Ori won't be too difficult for you. That aside, let's take some time to investigate why so many have been led to believe such false claims. I find that this line of thinking primarily came about because of how fast-paced the combat is, and how unforgiving it can be in the early stages. I know I just got done stressing how wrong it is to say that the game is too hard, but you definitely have to be more careful about what you do when you're first starting out. You don't have very very much health, damage mitigation, or damage potential early on, which can make it very easy to get sent straight back to the last checkpoint if you don't know what you're doing. What's more is that the checkpoint system can either be your saving grace or your nightmare depending on how you choose to progress your character's skill tree. As you'll see, I personally went for utility and exploration at first over pure combat, which made it easier to slowly ramp up the rate at which I gained skill points the further I went. I don't know for certain, but I'm pretty sure this is one of, if not the most efficient way to level up. Abilities like being able to reuse save points and water breathing take a lot of the excess challenge out. Of course, this still leaves the issue of not dealing much damage until the very late game, but I found that this style of progression gives you what you need most when you need it. That doesn't necessarily excuse the lack of explanation in regards to how new players could possibly know what skills would be most useful and when. I got lucky due to my overly cautious nature, but someone like Sir John Mac, for example, could be more inclined to choose combat over utility when starting out. I would most definitely have an easier time progressing than John in this case, because I'd be able to access more skill points sooner, and I'd even be afforded the opportunity to be more thorough in collecting such power-ups. Perhaps a more detailed map showcasing what lies ahead would allow players to make more educated guesses on what they should invest in, though that would bring up the problem of forcing players into a system that's too linear. Though I don't think that many would argue that the devs could have done a better job with the map. It is nice to have everything all in one place, though the console-like controls on a PC port do feel somewhat clunky when trying to navigate from one section to the next. Even when zooming into areas you've already explored, the amount of detail is lackluster at best. Hell, even with the maximum utility unlocks, allowing myself to see almost everything there is around the world, it can be confusing to traverse the terrain. Over time, you'll likely begin to memorize the intersections more commonly traveled, though it isn't all too rare to get lost. I found that I constantly referenced the map every single turn to alleviate this pain, though it begs the question if something like a small minimap in the corner of the screen couldn't have sufficed. It's not as though you don't already have access to the information anyways, and it would be nice to not have to pause every 5 seconds to ensure you're not walking into a dead end. Despite all of this negative talk, these are relatively minor gripes, as Ori's true beauty comes alive when you've unlocked a fair amount of abilities from the trees located in major progression hubs. There's nothing quite like the satisfaction that comes from breezing through the forest as though you were a leaf on the wind, flying by areas you once had to crawl through at a painstakingly slow pace. It will take a fair amount of effort to get there, but the overall flow of the late game is well worth the work it takes to earn, in my opinion at least. There is one major aspect to this game, or at least the original game, as I don't own the definitive edition, that I would like to bring special attention to, and that would be its optimization. There seems to be a major issue with Ori's receptivity to NVIDIA graphics cards that causes them to lose a great deal of performance. My old graphics card, which was a medium quality GTX series, couldn't play this game at anything but the lowest settings in windowed mode. That was the only way for me to get anywhere near 30 FPS at the time, and even still, I'd occasionally tank down to less than 10. Thankfully, my current GPU is a GTX 950, which is more than powerful enough to run this game at about 90 FPS relatively consistently. It would sometimes drop down to 60 or even 50 when streaming, but that's still perfectly playable. This issue is well known and documented, and it's nothing wrong with the consumer's devices. It's just a simple failure on Moon Studios' part to properly optimize their game for one of the largest sects of the PC gaming sphere. It's worth noting that AMD graphics cards perform perfectly fine and have reported no such problems running the game, which makes this issue all the more puzzling. Whatever the reason, I'm no game developer, so I couldn't possibly explain the nitty-gritty of what went wrong. What I can do is point out the issue that does seem to be lessened to some extent with the definitive edition. At least for what I could find, very few people have their rigs responding as poorly to Ori's newer edition compared to the original release while running NVIDIA cards. I can imagine most of you watching this review would lean more towards buying the definitive edition if anything, and I would even recommend doing so to gain access to some minor story elements that were added as well, though I don't think that would make my words here any less valid. Consumers shouldn't be obligated to spend half the amount of money I have on my rig to get a reasonable performance, and any consistent less than stellar results in this regard are purely the developer's fault. Getting away from the hypercritical mood I just set myself into, I do greatly enjoy this game. It's one of the best RPGs I've played in recent times, and one of the few that I've played all the way through to a semi-completionist level multiple times. Technical performance aside, I love almost everything about this title, and I wish more Metroidvania platformers would come out from time to time. It has an incredible feel to the standard gameplay loop, a wholly unique art style, and a charming, albeit dark story that's satisfying enough to sate my appetite for a good narrative. It's for these reasons that I find myself giving Ori and the Blind Forest Forest, a 9.3 out of 10. It definitely has some glaring issues, especially if you're playing the older versions with particular platforms, but the strengths of this game greatly outweigh its shortcomings. Even when I was fighting to get console-level performance off of my gaming PC, I still found myself glued to my seat. There's just something about this experience that's captivating enough to make me want more, and it takes a very special kind of creative direction to be able to pull that off. At the time of this review, Ori and the Blind Forest Definitive Edition can be bought on Steam and plenty of other places for $19.99. It seems as though the original game is no longer for sale on Steam, but who's to say if that's the case across all platforms. It does consistently go on sale a few times a year, namely during Christmas and summertime, so it's probably worth waiting if you have the mental fortitude. Well, I hope you all enjoyed this formal review, and if you did, feel free to give it a thumbs up. If you want to see more like it, maybe even subscribe. Links to my social media and whatnot are in the description below, and as for the comment question, this has to do with the game's ending, so if you don't want to have any spoilers, I'll give you a few seconds to click away from the video now. In regards to Kuro's last remaining child that we look after in the epilogue, what do you think will come of it? As we've already seen, those of the spirit tree are beings of light, whereas many of the creatures of the forest are kin of the shadows. It was an abnormal amount of light energy that ultimately killed most of Kuro's children, leaving only this one to fend for itself. And that's not even to mention that it was the light of the spirit tree itself that took Kuro's life. Do you think the owlet will grow to resent Ori for what he unknowingly caused to its family? Also, I know that there is a sequel game in the works, but it's impossible to say in what direction that story will go. I'm just referring to the one title for the time being. Anyways, that's all the time we've got for today, so until next time, don't die.